Hi, I'm Amy Goodman. In this time of COVID-19, climate chaos, and historic elections, you count on Democracy Now! To stay focused on the issues that matter most. We count on you to support our independent journalism. If everyone who tunes in to Democracy Now! Gave just $10, we could cover our operating costs for 2021. Really, that's all it would take. Please do your part today by visiting us at democracynow.org. Stay safe. Wear a mask, save lives. And thank you so much. From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We need a vaccine that everyone can have free of charge, no matter where you live or whether you're rich or you're poor. We need companies to share all their research so we can make enough safe vaccines for everyone. We need a vaccine owned by all of us.
While the United States, Britain, and other wealthy nations race to vaccinate their populations, a new report finds as many as 9 out of 10 people in dozens of poorer countries could miss out on the coronavirus vaccine until at least 2022 because wealthy countries have hoarded enough doses to vaccinate their entire populations nearly 3 times over. We'll look at the growing movement to develop a people's vaccine. Then to the case of Brandon Bernard, a black man scheduled to be executed Thursday on International Human Rights Day.
He was just a young kid when this crime happened of these people being killed. And he did play some part in it, but anybody who knows Brandon knows he would never have consented to killing people as what happened.
Brandon Bernard is one of 5 people scheduled to be executed by the federal government in the final weeks of the Trump administration. These are the first executions during a president's lame duck period, federal executions, in over 130 years. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The U.S. recorded over 2,500 deaths and over 215,000 confirmed COVID-19 cases yesterday alone, as the average number of daily cases has sailed past 200,000. Health experts say the first signs of spikes related to Thanksgiving travel are starting to emerge. Cases have risen over the last week in 38 states and the District of Columbia. On Tuesday, President-elect Joe Biden officially introduced his coronavirus response team and outlined his goals for tackling the pandemic when he takes office.
Masking, vaccinations, opening schools. These are the 3 key goals for my first 100 days. This team will help get at the last 100 million COVID-19 vaccine, at least 100 million COVID vaccine shots into the arms of the American people in the first 100 days.
The Food and Drug Administration's found Pfizer-BioNTech coronavirus vaccine to be successful in clinical trials, bringing it one step closer to being authorized for widespread use. Authorities say they'll start distributing the vaccine within days of the emergency use authorization, which is expected perhaps tomorrow. This comes as some trial participants warned they experienced intense symptoms, including chills, headaches, and fatigue after the second shot, which needs to be administered about 3 weeks after the first dose. Meanwhile, a new report finds as many as 9 out of 10 people in dozens of poorer countries around the world could miss out on the vaccine next year as the bulk of the supply is bought up by wealthier nations. The People's Vaccine Alliance says wealthy countries are hoarding enough doses to vaccinate their populations nearly 3 times over. In other coronavirus news, Iran says U.S. sanctions have prevented it from making a payment to COVAX, the UN's mechanism to ensure fair distribution of vaccines, possibly putting its receipt of nearly 17 million doses in jeopardy. That amount would cover around 10% of Iran's population. In California, coronavirus cases inside prisons have once again skyrocketed, with more than 4,000 active infections among prisoners, the highest number since the pandemic began. Altogether, over 22,000 prisoners have tested positive for COVID-19 in California, and at least 90 have died. Prisoners at San Quentin say authorities are preparing to transfer people to other prisons despite COVID-19 levels being at an all-time high. This is the award-winning incarcerated journalist Juan speaking to Democracy Now! From San Quentin.
The problem with the transfer is all California prisons are enclosed and unventilated. All throughout the state, our leaders are telling us, stay at home, don't mingle with people that you don't know, wear a mask inside, in which we're all doing that inside of these buildings. But I know we can't be operating on alternative facts when it comes to enclosed, unventilated buildings. We can't have one set of rules for restaurants, gyms, nail salons, etc., and another for prisons.
Juan has recently recovered from COVID-19. Meanwhile, in New Jersey, dozens of activists have been leading daily protests outside Bergen County Jail for 2 weeks in solidarity with immigrant prisoners held at the jail who've been on hunger strike for nearly a month. Immigration rights advocates reported Monday at least 4 of the 6 hunger strikers have been taken to the emergency room unconscious. The hunger strikers are demanding better health and safety conditions and for the release of all prisoners during the COVID pandemic. In news from Washington, D.C., the White House put forward a $916 billion stimulus package Tuesday in the hopes of breaking a stalemate in Congress. The proposal provides some relief for state and local governments and includes liability protections for businesses, which Republicans have insisted on. It does not include the weekly enhanced unemployment benefits from the first stimulus bill, but would extend other federal unemployment programs that expire soon. It would include one-off direct payments of $600 per person, half the amount of the previous bill. On Tuesday, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected a Republican challenge to the election results in Pennsylvania. Trump and Republicans have lost some 50 legal challenges since Trump was defeated by Joe Biden in the election and have failed to overturn results in any state. Despite this, congressional Republican leaders rejected a resolution Tuesday recognizing Joe Biden as president-elect. President-elect Joe Biden will reportedly select Tom Vilsack as his agriculture secretary, reprising the role he held under former President Obama. The news drew immediate condemnation from progressives and environmental and labor activists over Vilsack's track record of supporting corporate interests over farmers loosening regulations and backing of genetically modified herbicide-resistant crops. Vilsack also backed the mega merger between Bayer and Monsanto. He's currently the president and CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council, which represents large corporate dairy interests. Many small family farms have been decimated in recent years due to agricultural monopolies and plunging dairy prices. In other cabinet news, Ohio Congressmember Marcia Fudge has been tapped to lead the Department of Housing and Urban Development. If confirmed, Fudge would be the first African-American woman to lead HUD. Following the news, many progressives expressed hope former Ohio State Senator and prominent Bernie Sanders surrogate Nina Turner would run for Fudge's congressional Ohio seat. In international news, Ethiopia admitted federal troops fired at and detained UN workers in the conflict-torn northern Tigray region for attempting to enter areas they say are forbidden. Humanitarian groups have been trying to reach refugees and displaced people in the embattled region as they warn the situation is increasingly critical with shortages of food, clean water and other necessities. This comes as Reuters is reporting the United States believes Eritrean soldiers have crossed into Ethiopia to fight alongside the Ethiopian military in its battle against Tigrayan forces. Both Ethiopia and Eritrea have denied the reports. Ethiopia and Eritrea signed a historic peace deal in 2018, ending 2 decades of hostilities. A new study shows the number of Afghan civilians killed in airstrikes led by the U.S. and allies has risen by 330% since 2017. The study, published by the Cost of War Project at Brown University, reports in 2019 alone about 700 people were killed by airstrikes carried out by the Trump administration. Meanwhile, Save the Children reports Afghanistan was one of the most dangerous countries in the world for children as a result of the ongoing war between the U.S.-backed Afghan government and the Taliban. UN data showed over 26,000 children have been killed or injured from 2005 to 2019. In Paris, French President Emmanuel Macron welcomed Egyptian leader Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to the Élysée Palace Monday, saying France would continue to sell weapons to Egypt. This comes despite mounting accusations of human rights violations against Sisi's government, including the use of forced disappearances, mass arrests, and torture amidst an unprecedented crackdown on activists and journalists in Egypt. This is President Macron speaking Monday.
I will not condition matters of defense and economic cooperation and disagreements over human rights. First, because I believe in the sovereignty of the peoples and in respect of our legitimate and reciprocal interests.
The number of displaced people around the world because of conflict topped 80 million in 2020, in what the United Nations calls a bleak milestone. The UN said the pandemic exacerbated the displacement crisis, despite calls early on from the Secretary General for a global ceasefire while the world battles COVID-19. Areas that saw significant fresh displacement include Syria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mozambique, Somalia, Yemen, and Africa's Central Sahel region. In Greece, Human Rights Watch warns refugees and aid workers may be at risk of lead poisoning from a new refugee camp built by Greek authorities on a former military shooting range on the island of Lesbos. Human Rights Watch says authorities did not conduct proper testing on the soil before moving thousands of refugees to the new camp. In September, over 12,000 refugees were displaced after a massive fire completely destroyed the Moria camp. Currently, over 7,500 people, mostly from Afghanistan and Syria, are living in the new camp. In the United States, in immigration news, the Trump administration's agreed to extend temporary protective status for people from Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Haiti, Sudan, and Nepal until at least October 2021. The extension is part of a deal between the U.S. government and plaintiffs who have sued to preserve TPS after the Trump administration killed the humanitarian relief program earlier this year. This comes as immigration rights advocates have been demanding the Trump administration give TPS to refugees from all Central American countries devastated by hurricanes Eta and Iota. In related news, the Norwegian Refugee Council's warning over 400,000 people in Honduras and Guatemala are in urgent need of humanitarian aid in the wake of the two hurricanes. The House on Tuesday overwhelmingly passed a $741 billion defense bill with a veto-proof majority. The bill requires military bases be stripped of Confederate names, which Trump has previously said would lead him to veto the package. Trump also threatened to veto if lawmakers do not crack down on social media companies he claims were biased against him in the election. The bill also will require federal officers at protests to identify themselves and their agencies following outcry over their presence and lack of accountability during racial justice protests over the summer. In addition, the defense measure calls for pay raises for troops and slowing down the planned drawdown of forces in Afghanistan and Germany, and makes it more difficult to deploy military personnel to the U.S.-Mexico border. Minnesota Congressmember Ilhan Omar voted against the bill, saying, quote, "It's unconscionable to pass a Pentagon budget that continues to fund unnecessary projects and endless wars during a time of widespread suffering across our country." In Texas, the U.S. Army has fired or suspended 14 officers and soldiers stationed at Fort Hood. This comes following an investigation into sexual assaults and murders at Fort Hood, including the bludgeoning to death of 20-year-old soldier Vanessa Guillen, whose remains were found in July. The probe was spurred in large part by pressure and advocacy of Guillen's family. In response to the news, Vanessa's sister, Myra Guillen, said on Twitter, quote, "This isn't justice. Those responsible need to be held accountable, not just fired. Justice for Vanessa Guillen," she said. In Portland, Oregon, at least 7 people were arrested Tuesday during a standoff between police and over 100 housing activists who were attempting to reclaim the home of an Indigenous and Black family evicted in September. Authorities say the family was not protected by eviction moratoriums because their home had been foreclosed. Protesters have been camping outside the home to protest gentrification and evictions in Portland. A local business owner told Oregon Public Broadcasting, quote, "We should help another family stay in the community. We should not want to destroy them so we can build skyrises and apartment complexes to get wealthy." A federal appeals court has rejected the Trump administration's approval of the construction of the country's first offshore oil production facility in federal Arctic waters. The proposed project involved building a 9-acre artificial island so a private company could drill for oil in the Beaufort Sea. This comes as the Trump administration's racing to sell oil drilling rights in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge before Joe Biden's inauguration. A major lease sale is scheduled for January 6th. And a longtime activist, Soren Ambrose, has died in Kenya at the age of 57 from complications due to COVID-19. He was a key strategist in the anti-globalization movement. As a member of the group 50 Years is Enough, he helped organize the April 2000 protests in Washington against the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. In 2001, the Financial Times credited Ambrose with, quote, trying to dismantle the world's financial architecture. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. When we come back, we'll look at the growing movement to develop a people's vaccine. Stay with us.
Esa vaina se quita, no estás sola, ten paciencia y verás, no estás solo, y aunque eso mortifica, no estás solo, te vamos a cuidar, no estás solo, aquí están tus amigos, no estás sola, tu familia aquí está, no estás sola. Y aunque eso mortifica, no estás solo, te vamos a cuidar.
The Song for the Sick by Ruben Blades and Carlos Vives. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by co-host Juan González in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, President-elect Joe Biden pledged Tuesday to distribute 100 million vaccine shots in the first 100 days of his administration. Biden's vow came on the same day Britain began a mass vaccination program using a vaccine developed by Pfizer-BioNTech. The vaccine's expected to be soon approved in the United States as well, as early as tomorrow. On Tuesday, President Trump held what he called a vaccine summit at the White House. Trump claimed COVID deaths and hospitalizations would quickly decrease, but the White House Coronavirus Task Force is warning the spread of COVID would not be reduced until the spring based on current vaccination plans. A report by the task force obtained by CNN states, quote, the current vaccine implementation will not substantially reduce viral spread, hospitalizations, or fatalities until the 100 million Americans with comorbidities can be fully immunized, which will take until the late spring, unquote. Meanwhile, a new report finds as many as 9 out of 10 people in dozens of poorer countries could miss out on the coronavirus vaccine until at least 2022 because wealthy countries, including the United States, have hoarded enough doses to vaccinate their entire populations nearly 3 times over. The report was issued by the People's Vaccine Alliance, which includes Amnesty International, Frontline AIDS, Global Justice Now, and Oxfam. This is Winifred Byanyima, Executive Director of UNAIDS, in a video produced by the People's Vaccine Alliance.
Huge pharmaceutical companies are keeping the vaccine research a secret. They're deciding how many vaccines get made, how much to charge for them, and who gets vaccinated. This will no doubt leave billions of people behind. Pharma companies are putting profit, not people, first. Yet, billions of dollars of taxpayers' money is funding their work. We cannot let the CEOs of a handful of pharmaceutical companies decide our future. We need a vaccine that everyone can have free of charge, no matter where you live or whether you're rich or you're poor. We need companies to share all their research so we can make enough safe vaccines for everyone. We need a vaccine owned by all of us. To end this COVID-19 pandemic, we need to pull together once more.
That was the UN AIDS Executive Director, part of the People's Vaccine Alliance. The World Health Organization has also warned about the inequitable distribution of the vaccine. This is WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus.
We simply cannot accept a world in which the poor and marginalized are trampled by the rich and powerful in the stampede for vaccines. This is a global crisis, and the solutions must be shared equitably as global public goods, not as private commodities that widen inequalities.
We're joined right now by two guests. In Oxford, England, Dr. Moga Kamal Yaneh. She's policy advisor to the People's Vaccine Alliance and to UNAIDS, the joint UN program on HIV and AIDS. She's worked for decades on access to medicines and healthcare in developing countries. And in Bangalore, India, Achal Prabhala is with us, coordinator of the Access IBSA project, which campaigns for access to medicines in India, Brazil, and South Africa. He recently co-authored an op-ed published in the New York Times headlined, "Want Vaccines Fast? Suspend Intellectual Property Rights." We're going to begin with the doctor, Dr. Moga Kamal Yaneh. You're in Oxford, actually, where the one of those vaccine tests has began, and that is AstraZeneca, Oxford. But start off by talking about what is a people's vaccine and what are the inequities right now? Who will get this vaccine, what countries, and what countries won't?
Well, the People's Vaccine is a coalition of organizations like Amnesty, Frontline AIDS, Global Justice, Oxfam. It's co-led by Oxfam and UNAIDS, and it has so many people, academics, health activists, health experts, NGOs, patient groups from all over the world, united for one aim, which has a people's vaccine, not a profit vaccine. So we want a vaccine. Basically, we're calling for vaccination that that is available for all people at risk, and then for everybody once we have enough doses, but not the way it's happening now, where if you happen to be born in a rich country, you get the vaccine. If you happen to be born in a poor country, you don't. And I mean, yesterday in the UK, they started vaccinating older people, and there was some clapping, and it was a lot of joy. And of course, that's brilliant, that there is hope that this problem that we're all suffering from will be, like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. However, that joy is only limited to people living here. I've got friends and relatives and people that I work with in other countries, in developing countries, who are saying, yeah, and what about us? And yeah, what about them? So this is really a big problem. There's just so many. It's kind of dividing the world between those who have and can pay and those who don't and can't pay. And therefore, well, you can stand in the back of the queue. We don't know when you can get the vaccine. And that is just not right. It's not right on moral grounds. It's not right on public health grounds, because everybody's saying nobody's safe until everybody's safe. Yeah, okay. How do you make everybody safe? So a vaccine nationalism will not get you to everybody's safe. And also on economic ground, you're not going to get the economy growing if just one, or back to normal, if one country vaccinates its population and the rest of the world isn't. You can't trade with people who are sick, or people who have high level of infection. So it just doesn't make sense at all. The other important point is that this is not kind of fact of life that we have limited amount of vaccines. Actually, that's not the case. There are other options that will enable the world to produce more vaccines and therefore vaccinate more people. So basically what's happening now, if you can imagine that we have a small pie, so that's one vaccine, a small pie, and so basically the rich can have the bigger share of it, and then we'll have just crumbs left for developing countries. While the idea is that, well, why don't we increase the pie so everybody can have a decent share of it, rather than fighting on a little one?
Well, Dr. Kamalyani, I wanted to ask you about the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine and how access to that vaccine may be more equitable at this stage. Could you talk about some of the agreements that the AstraZeneca has reached with the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance?
Well, basically, I mean, this vaccine has been developed by Oxford University. Oxford University had a standard on managing intellectual property, and it actually talks about open license. However, when they did the deal or the contract with AstraZeneca, it became exclusive license for AstraZeneca. But they managed to put some conditions in the contract about making the vaccine accessible to developing countries. So AstraZeneca went to one of the big vaccine producers in India, the Serum Institute, and made an agreement to produce 1 billion doses. So that's vaccinating 500 million people. Half of them will be in India. So it's a good way, good start to make more vaccines available. AstraZeneca also has some agreements with other countries, like with Argentina and Brazil. So that may cover a number of people in Latin America. But what about the rest of the population? There's some other deals with countries, but not production as such. You can't leave, so AstraZeneca compared to others, yes, they've done good things, and also fixing the price as, AstraZeneca said $4 per dose, and Serum said $3 per dose. So for developing countries, it will be probably $3 per dose, so $6 per course, or per person. But the thing is, you can't leave, this is the whole thing, you can't leave the decision on supply, price, which country, which patient, to companies. That's not their job. Their job is to produce. And the job of governments is to make more production. So you have to enable other producers, like in India, there's other producers, other countries would have other producers. So if you allow technology transfer, so sharing technology, which the technology, by the way, a lot of it has been developed by public money, including from the US and the UK and Europe and other countries. So allowing the sharing of technology and removing the intellectual property barrier, so no patents on vaccines, then other companies can produce the vaccine, and we have more. And just like AstraZeneca did this contract with Serum that includes presumably technology transfer or some technology transfer, that can be done on a multilateral level, on a bigger level for more companies. Because all these deals, by the way, they're all secret. You don't know what's in it except what they announce. Rather than if you have a multilateral agreement, you don't, the negotiation happens in closed door. But then once they agree a license, then it's public. Then you see what's good and what's bad about it.
And what about the whole issue that many developing countries are relying on the possibility of an effective vaccine coming from China? And China obviously is in last stage clinical trials for several vaccines. The potential for China being the one that supplies the bulk of the vaccines to the majority of the people of the planet, what that would mean in terms of international relations in the future?
Well, I mean, China has 4 vaccines in clinical trials, phase 3. Actually, the Emirate today announced that one of these vaccines passed clinical trials, and they authorized it to work in their country. They were convinced with the safety and efficacy of the clinical trials. So yes, if developing countries have nothing coming, they can't just sit. And I heard that from a number of countries. We're not going to sit and wait. So they are talking to companies in Europe and in America, but they're also talking to companies in China. And the King of Morocco said that he's going to vaccinate his people, and they're aiming at vaccinating 80% of the population. And again, they have an agreement with a Chinese company. That put the kind of the pressure on ensuring that these vaccines are, have high efficacy and high safety level, or at least acceptable safety level. And the thing is, we need that all clinical trials get published, whether that's from China or Pfizer or Moderna. It's no good that companies announce their results in a press release to investors, so they have more, their share value and their market value increase, but scientists who are waiting, who understand these things, cannot investigate or review the results because there's nothing published for them. So we need more of transparency on that, including the Chinese, so that countries are aware of what they're buying.
I wanted to bring Achal Pravala into the conversation, again, coordinator of Access IBSA project, which campaigns to access medicines for India, Brazil, South Africa. This piece you recently wrote in the New York Times, Want Vaccines Fast? Suspend Intellectual Property Rights. You're joining us from Bangalore, India. Can you talk about what that would mean if you suspended intellectual property rights? Talk about trade secrets, talk about patents, talk about government subsidies of these private companies, and how does what's happening now, the development of this vaccine, compare to people's access, for example, to the flu vaccine, how that was developed and financed?
Thank you, Amy. Firstly, it's great to be here, and thank you for having me. The piece that we wrote in the New York Times was geared around an event that's unfolding this week and the next. It doesn't look like it'll get resolved anytime soon or successfully, but that event is a proposal that South Africa and India made at the WTO, at the World Trade Organization, to temporarily suspend a trade rule called TRIPS, which is an agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property, the super governance of intellectual property worldwide, which the WTO takes on. And the reason India and South Africa suggested that all member countries of the WTO should be exempted from provisions of TRIPS is so that everything that we require to survive the pandemic, the masks, the test kits, but now especially the vaccines, should be free to be made in as much capacity as possible to get them faster and cheaper to as many people as we can around the world. There is an overwhelming support from developing countries for this proposal, but the WTO works on consensus, which means that even if 5 or 6 very rich countries oppose the proposal, it actually won't pass. And that's exactly what's happening. The US, the EU, the UK, and a few other rich countries, as well as inexplicably Brazil, have opposed this proposal and are stalling it, which means that it's unlikely to go through without a fight. Now, the irony of the fight having to take place this week is there's really good news out of the UK. There's also really good news out of science. And personally, for me, sitting in India, I wish I could share in that good news with the same spirit of cheer and celebration. I saw a moving interview with a 91-year-old called Martin Kenyon in London, who called his hospital, said, "Hey, I heard you had vaccines." They said, "Yes, come on over and get one." He walked over and he got a Pfizer vaccine, the first dose of a Pfizer vaccine, and he's looking forward to hugging his grandchildren this Christmas, and it's a beautiful, touching story. The problem with that is that Pfizer vaccine, over 90% of its supplies until the end of 2021, so that means for the next 13 months, have been sold out to a handful of rich countries, to the US, to the EU, and to the UK. There's actually no way that anyone in India or anyone anywhere outside these rich countries is going to get their hands on one of these vaccines for love or for money. They just don't exist outside a very few number of rich countries. That's kind of amazing to live through in 2020. I've been campaigning for access to medicines for a long time, but my father had COVID. He's 87 years old. My mother is 72 years old. I definitely would like them to have a vaccine and get one fairly quickly. The prospect of these vaccines being unrolled without any possibility of a majority of the world getting them is genuinely heartbreaking. And that's the anger that partly prompted that piece. The irony, of course, is that this is such a dramatically different situation from the 1950s when the flu vaccine was developed by Jonas Salk, who, of course, famously said, when asked by Ed Murrow about whether he was going to patent his invention, he said, can you patent the sun? And it's a heartbreak. It's a beautiful, it's a beautiful moment. It's a really beautiful moment. And
that was about the polio vaccine.
I'm sorry, that was about the polio vaccine. That's exactly right. And that's about the polio vaccine. The tradition of Jonas Salk, however, does continue with the flu vaccine that we all take. That flu vaccine is developed at a unit of the WHO, which is called informally the Flu Network and formally the Global Influenza Surveillance and Research Systems. It's a collaborative infrastructure that they've set up at the WHO that involves 110 different countries, 130 different laboratories, which pool information on what strains of influenza are circulating in their countries. That information is collated, and every year for 2 different flu seasons in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, the WHO then releases what would be called the formula for the flu vaccine, which then anyone, anywhere can produce because it's completely free of any proprietary intellectual property or monopoly, which means that billions of people have taken it since the 1970s based on this cooperative shared system of pooling knowledge as well as finances. And that's created a very robust infrastructure for the production and consumption of these flu vaccines. And it's a great success. It's unfortunately exactly the kind of thing that's not being replicated with the coronavirus vaccines.
Well, Achal Prabal, I wanted to ask you, in terms of the refusal of these handful of rich countries to allow the suspension of intellectual property rights at the WTO, what is their argument? Given the enormous worldwide crisis that we're functioning, how do they defend this, and what could possibly be done to overcome this resistance?
Juan, that's an excellent question. And look, I think in some way, I've been debating several people on this just this week after the New York Times piece came out, as well as previously because of my work. I wish actually sometimes that people would just be honest and upfront and say, look, we actually care about these corporations more than global human life. We're actually fine with a certain number of usually poor people dying for a lack of access to these vaccines, as long as the companies and the industry that makes them survives. I'd be willing to listen to that argument because it at least would be honest. What happens instead is that the arguments that are advanced are, A, that it's not a problem, to say that it's not a problem ignores 20 years of human history where millions of people died because of lack of access to monopoly drugs for AIDS, and then did so again for lack of access to drugs for cancer, and then did so again for lack of access to hepatitis C drugs. And by the way, are doing today in the United States for lack of access to insulin, which is again patented, for a lack of access to PrEP for AIDS, or for a lack of access to cystic fibrosis drugs in the UK. So it's to deny reality. But the logic that's advanced is that the innovation system requires these monopolies to exist in order to reward private pharmaceutical corporations for taking big risks with private money. Except for the fact that that's not what's happening here. It's never happened, but it's never happened as starkly as it is not happening in the pandemic. Moderna, which is just one of the vaccines that posted successful results a couple of weeks ago, has admitted in its own financial reports that 100% of its vaccine development project was funded by BARDA, by Warp Speed and the US government, US taxpayer money. On top of that, it's been given pre-orders of another $1.5 billion from the United States, and another substantial amount of money, nearing about $1 billion, from the European Union. Every other vaccine, from Pfizer to AstraZeneca, also has substantial government money. German taxpayer money of up to $445 million went into the Pfizer vaccine. AstraZeneca received huge subsidies through public money from the United Kingdom through its early development at Oxford University. All of these vaccines have, on top of that, received these very lucrative, very large pre-orders. Now, you can't have it all ways. You cannot have a vaccine project literally contracted out. I hesitate to say subsidy because when it's 100% of the cost, that's not a subsidy, that's ownership. You cannot have a prize like a pre-order of $6 billion, which is basically what Pfizer has awaiting it on successful completion of its trials and approval. And on top of that, say, but we also need the intellectual property monopoly because of all this private capital we've risked, which doesn't seem to actually exist. It is very, very strange, but this is the argument that's being advanced. It doesn't hold water. I think they understand that as well. It's just that this argument has a rich history. It's embedded in a particular kind of thinking, a particular branch of economics, which they know that they can ride on and, in effect, lie their way through opposing what is really a very sensible and unradical proposal made by South Africa and India at the WTO.
So finally, how exactly, summing up in a minute, if you got around trade secrets, if the companies were forced to release their trade secrets, they didn't get patents on this, how would a people's vaccine work? Every company all over could just develop the vaccine where it is. What's shocking, President Trump signed some executive order, not clear how enforceable it is, called America First. We have learned, if you're altruistic or not, if someone is sick somewhere in the world, you are in danger. So this is, everyone is in this together. But what would a people's vaccine, how would it happen?
What it requires is, firstly, for companies to say there are two aspects of our monopoly that we'll give up. We'll share with you our patents and we'll share with you our trade secrets. Trade secrets are the know-how and the technology that's required to make a vaccine. It's a very important part of the process. If they were to say, look, we'll license this to any company with a reputation and a quality certification that's willing to make this vaccine with us, then let's open it up and let's have anyone interested do it. And if they did that, they would suddenly find that there are whole avenues of supply that open up around the world. There are over 20 vaccine manufacturers in India, but there are also 8 vaccine manufacturers on the continent of Africa. And there are a number of ways in which you can do this collaboratively. The one way not to do it is the way that they are, by producing these artificially limited quantities of these vaccines by sort of keeping it all to themselves.
And I wanted to ask Dr. Kamal Yani again about the situation with the Trump administration had removed the United States from the World Health Organization. President-elect Biden is now saying he will return the U.S. to the WHO. What do you think has been the impact of the United States pulling out of the WHO in the midst of this pandemic?
Well, I mean, what do you say about such an amazing, really, incredible, irresponsible, I'm afraid, decision in the middle of pandemic to do that? I mean, it's strange decision, even if we're not in pandemic. So what do you think if we are in the middle of it? It's really, really not very good. My dream, to be honest, as a non-American about your election is to retain two things. One, the American role in advancing global health, and particularly in joining the WHO, and also putting science before politics. This has been also very, very problematic from the U.S. It really affected not just decision makers in other countries, but also ordinary people. This ignoring the science behind COVID was really, really bad. So we do hope that the new administration, I mean, they made commitment, Biden made a commitment to join the WHO. That is fantastic. The sooner, the better, that would be great. But also for the U.S. to join something like, or to voice public support for something like this technology access pool that WHO and other countries co-sponsored, to do the facilitation of licensing intellectual property, and so managing intellectual property, that your previous question, but also facilitating technology transfer to other companies. So supporting the CTAB would be absolutely fantastic. For the U.S. and new administration, I mean, it's not it wouldn't catch that December meeting that my colleague was talking about, but in general, playing a positive role in the WTO in putting public health before profit. And we're not saying companies don't make profit. We're not saying that at all. But we're saying that public health comes before profit, which is, by the way, something that all the World Trade Organization members agreed on in Doha in 2001.
Dr. Moga Kamal, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Dr. Moga Kamal-Yaneh, People's Vaccine Alliance and UNAIDS. And thank you to Achal Pravala, the Access IBSA Project, co-authored New York Times headlined piece that we will link to, Want Vaccines Fast? Suspend Intellectual Property Rights. He's speaking to us from Bangalore, and the doctor speaking to us from Oxford, England. When we come back, we look at why former jurors and even a prosecutor are speaking out against the federal execution of an African-American man, Brandon Bernard, scheduled to die Thursday on International Human Rights Day. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan González. As COVID-19 rips across the United States, federal officials now admit 8 members of a 40-person team who traveled from around the country to carry out the federal execution of Orlando Hall last month have contracted the virus, as well as his spiritual advisor. Hall was one of 8 people President Trump has sent to their deaths so far this year after breaking a 17-year hiatus on the federal death penalty. And in the final weeks of his administration, he plans to execute 5 more people, including tomorrow, International Human Rights Day. These are the first executions during a president's lame duck period in over 130 years, since Grover Cleveland executed 3 people of color. On Thursday, the federal government plans to kill a 40-year-old black man named Brandon Bernard, who was 18 years old when he was allegedly an accomplice to a murder of a young white couple in Texas. Bernard did not kill either person and says he was a getaway driver during a robbery gone wrong. But during his trial, his attorneys did not make opening statements, and in the penalty stage, they called no witnesses. Out of the 12 jurors, all but one was white. Now, 5 of the 9 surviving jurors have changed their minds and say that Brandon should not be executed. This is former juror Gary McClung speaking to CBS News reporter David Benioff.
Why didn't you vote against the death penalty then?
I've always struggled, I guess, especially at that time in my life of standing on my convictions, and I regret that now. The death penalty is far too harsh for his level of involvement in this crime.
In addition to jurors, the former assistant U.S. attorney who helped secure his death sentence is calling for Bernard's execution to be halted. She's Angela Moore. She wrote in the Indianapolis Star, "Executing Brandon would be a terrible stain on the nation's honor." This is Angela Moore speaking to CBS News.
The legal reasons, aside from my own personal beliefs, is the evidence and what we have found out since. Mr. Bernard did not shoot and kill the victims in this case. He was not the person who planned this robbery gone wrong.
Why didn't you speak up then?
First of all, it wouldn't have mattered. The federal government, when you're a prosecutor, at least in our district, you are not allowed to concede error.
Even a former federal prison warden has said that Brandon Bernard his sentence should be commuted because of his good conduct during his 20 years on death row. But on Tuesday, a federal judge denied the request to halt Bernard's execution. As his options narrow, his aunt, Rasha Williams, visited him at the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, where he's scheduled to be executed on Thursday.
My heart is broken over the thought of my nephew being executed. I went there ready to encourage him and be uplifting to him, and it was just the opposite. He uplifted us, and he's at peace, and he has accepted what has happened, but he is hopeful.
For more, we go to Terre Haute, Indiana, where every federal prisoner on death row, when they are executed, is executed. It's there that Brandon Bernard is scheduled to become the 9th person put to death this year by the Trump administration. We're joined by Liliana Segura. She's the criminal justice reporter for The Intercept. Her latest piece is headlined, "Trump Prepares to Kill Brandon Bernard, Even as Jurors Say His Life Should Be Spared." Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Liliana. You have just taken a long journey, driven to Terre Haute. Tell us what we should understand about Brandon Bernard's case.
Thank you so much for having me, Amy. And yeah, you're right. I arrived here yesterday, and I've done this trip now multiple times. I've been here since July, since these executions started. And before I get to Brandon's case specifically, I just wanted to say, listening to your coverage of this vaccine and this moment, as the world sort of is fighting to try to develop and distribute a vaccine that will save us from this pandemic, it really is a sort of sick irony that I'm here to cover a push to execute so many people, and not only the executions themselves, but using lethal injection, which is a perversion of medicine. It's using drugs developed to heal in order to kill. And so I just wanted to say that because your previous segments really have just brought that to the forefront, just how perverse this is. You laid out a lot of the problems in Brandon Bernard's case. It's very rare that you have 5 of the surviving jurors. There are 9 surviving jurors, 5 of them speaking up, saying that they would like to see clemency in this case. It's important to know, every juror has sort of different reasons individually, and some of them have come out with, in support of clemency because of new evidence that they hadn't been aware of before that would have changed their decision at the time of the trial. But I sat down with Gary McClung last month, and he revealed to me that he always, from the moment that trial happened and from the moment he voted in favor of a death sentence for both Christopher Villalba and Brandon Bernard, that he felt really uneasy with it. It was clear he didn't understand why the 2 men had been tried together. It was clear to him that Brandon Bernard was not culpable, and they were both extremely young. Brandon Bernard was 18 years old. So I think that jurors, they're human beings. And oftentimes when they vote for death, even at that time, they're not entirely sure about how right or just these sentences are. So Gary McClung also talked about some of the things that they didn't know. It's really important to hear. Brandon Bernard's death sentence hinges on evidence that has been called into significant question, and there's 2 very important pieces to that. As you laid out, this was 5 teenagers targeted a couple named Todd and Stacy Bagley, who were visiting Killeen, Texas from Iowa. They were youth ministers, by all accounts, extremely good people, randomly targeted by teenagers, by all accounts, led by Christopher Villalba, who has since been executed. They were carjacked, they were taken to a remote location, forced into their trunk. The teenagers drove around trying to get money from an ATM, and ultimately Christopher Villalba shot the couple in the head. When Todd and Stacy Bagley were abducted, Brandon Bernard was not there. He was inside a convenience store playing video games, actually. And although he had been involved in the crime and it was his car, one of the guns belonged to him, his role really was incredibly limited up until that point. And then what ended up the reason he got a death sentence ultimately is that he went to the scene and according to the prosecutors, was the one who set this car on fire. So they were essentially burning the evidence. The way that this was communicated to the jury, jurors essentially were led to believe that Brandon Bernard was responsible for burning Stacy Bagley alive because there was evidence that there was soot found in her airways. And so they really federal prosecutors really emphasized this point that she had been alive. Except for she had been shot in the head, she was no longer conscious. Her death was a foregone conclusion. And jurors were very confused on that point. And there are jurors who have since said, if I had understood that she wasn't going to survive, that she couldn't suffer, I would have voted differently. The other piece of evidence is what Angela Moore was alluding to, I believe, which is that, they brought on at trial a Bureau of Prison employee who talked about how gang members essentially pose an immense danger. They can't be securely confined in prison. And his testimony made it sound like Brandon Bernard is going to pose a future danger. In 2018, Brandon's legal team discovered that, in fact, federal prosecutors had access to documents that showed pretty definitively that Brandon Bernard was sort of the lowest in the sort of ranking of gang members, that he was at the very bottom, that Brandon Bernard was not one of the gang leaders, one of the sort of most culpable members of this crew. That evidence was not disclosed to Brandon's legal team, and to this day, the courts have not allowed for a hearing for any litigation of this particular issue.
And Liliana, we only have about 2 minutes left, but I wanted to ask you about this whole issue of Brandon Bernard's age. Angela Moore makes the point in her op-ed piece that she did not really understand at the time, as a prosecutor, the reality that teenage boys don't really develop their full mental capacities until they're 20 or so, and but yet he was tried as an adult. Could you talk about that whole issue of what his capacity as an adult was while he was tried?
And we only have a minute to go.
Sure. So in 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a landmark decision called Roper versus Simmons. And that decision basically said that teenagers, people under 18, should not be cannot be sentenced to death because the teenage brain has not yet developed enough to a level where they are as culpable as adults in even the most horrific crimes. And that science that has continued, the neurological research, has shown that that development doesn't stop at 18. It goes well into one's 20s. And so this is sort of an artificial line that's been drawn. But the truth is that both Christopher Villalba and Brandon Bernard were incredibly young at the time and are very unlikely to have been sentenced to death if this crime were to take place today. So I hope that answers your question. You know, he has grown up on death row. The guys I'm in touch with on federal death row describe him in really positive terms, and also described Christopher Villalba that way. You know, in their opinion, neither of them, and especially Brandon Bernard, should not die for this crime that he committed, this mistake that he made when he was 18.
Well, Liliana Segura, we want to thank you for being with us. We're going to link to your piece at The Intercept, criminal justice reporter there. The piece, Trump Prepares to Kill Brandon Bernard, even as jurors say his life should be spared. One of 4 African-American men and a woman who are slated to die in the lame duck period of President Trump. The first time federal executions performed at this time in 130 years. That does it for our show. A belated happy 92nd birthday to Noam Chomsky. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan González. Be safe, wear a mask.